months later, I was okay. I called him outside. Dr. Hilson had left the hospital about to run the virus, but I tracked him down. My man is about to become huge, I explained. I don't know if I can make him that long. I didn't like him. I was determined to survive. He has therapy, but I kept the 7-inch heels on. Part 3. I've been up and down, I've been all around. Chapter 28. Early in 1976, we were getting ready to make our next studio album, Bill Quincy. We could use Kiss Alive as a springboard to take it to another level. We could be a one-hit wonder that just goes right back to doing what we were doing before. We had a point. To go back to what we had done earlier did seem stupid. After all, it didn't work before Alive, so why would it work now? Reaching our first 3 hours didn't sound as good as listening to the sound of it. There was something intrinsically wrong with it, though I still couldn't put my finger on exactly what it was. Bill suggested we bring in Bob Ezra to produce the new record. Bob was already known for the great records he made with Alice Cooper, and he proved to have a vast musical vocabulary. It turned out to be a brilliant move on Bill's part. Bob was a gift. We may have had a huge album under our belts, but we still didn't know anything more than we did before Alive had been made. Still, for a bunch of guys who thought they were hot shit, it was initially jarring to go into a studio with someone who treated us like children. As we began work on what would become Destroyer, Bob made a point of letting us know he was the boss. He wore a whistle around his neck and referred to us as campers. He told us we didn't go on it, which was true. He told us never to stop playing until he said so. Once at the end of a take, long after a fade-out would have ended the recording, Gene stopped playing. Bob came out of the control room and ran up to him. He stuck his finger so close to Gene's nose that he made his eyes close and said, "Don't you ever stop until I tell you to stop." A trickle of sweat ran down Gene's forehead. He never stopped again. It was humbling, particularly at a time when we thought we were God's gift to rock and roll and finally had a record to walk around playing. Live was platinum by this point. But Bob clearly knew a lot more than we did. He was trained. He was worthy of respect. He taught us a lot. One of the most significant things he did was challenge us not to write "fuck me, suck me" songs. No more "I'm a rock star, suck my dick," he insisted. And as we worked on lyrics, he had no problem saying very plainly, "No, I don't like it." I would never have written a lyric for Detroit Rock City without Bob on it. He pushed us far beyond our limits. During the process of making the record, Bob lived in an apartment directly across the street from Alvarez on 52nd Street. He had a piano, and when we weren't in rehearsal space or studio, I spent a lot of time there. Gene and I also sometimes took amplifiers over Gene's place of work. We wrote "Shout It Out Loud" at Bob's apartment. The riff in God of Thunder reflected the way my limitations as a guitar player are key to what I came up with and probably helped make my songs identifiable and unique. That riff was a compromise between what I heard in my head and what I could actually play. Another example of that process was "I Want You," which ended up on the next album. Sometimes at the rehearsal space, Bob would have the 4 of us sit in a circle and he would say, "Who's got an idea? Anybody have an idea for a verse? Who's got a part?" Someone would play a snippet and he might say, "No." Then somebody else would play something and Bob would shout, "Okay, that's good. Now who has another part?" A lot of the songs came together like that. Pieces of this and that stitched together with input from Bob. Peter sat at his drums while we threw out ideas. When it came time to arrange finished songs, Bob often came up with parts. Once I saw him work with us, I understood Alice Cooper's albums much more. I could see Bob's point of view in them. Bob's fingerprints were all over things like $1 Billion Babies. Suddenly, I could hear his drum parts and his bass parts. I knew them from our stuff, like the bass line in Detroit Rock City, which Bob created. That bass part is similar to the bass in Curtis Mayfield's Freddie's Dead. Bob even came up with the guitar solo in Detroit Rock City. He sang it to Ace and made me figure it out. Bob was brilliant at that kind of stuff. When it came time for the drums, we faced a real challenge. Bob spent many hours teaching Peter his parts. Bob Bob came up with most of the drum parts on the album, and he would dismiss the rest of us for hours at a time to work with him. Detroit Rock City in particular had a very challenging drum band. It took a lot of effort and patience for Bob to get Peter to be able to play something he couldn't have learned to play on his own if his life depended on it. Back then, there were no click tracks, which allow a drummer to work with a sort of metronome to get a consistent tempo. But to get a track the way he wanted it, Bob liked to be able to cut and splice from various takes we recorded, which necessitated a steady pace. That would have been difficult in our case, to say the least. So Bob created a human click track. He sat in the control room with a mic, stuck into a hole in a cigar box, and tapped the beat on the box and fed it to all of us, most importantly, Peter. Bob also wrote the lion's share of Beth, using a few lines from the recording. Peter had a co-writer on every song he ever wrote because he couldn't even write. Song structure and concepts of making the lyrics rhyme were totally lost on him. In the case of Beth, Bob wrote most of it, even though the original idea Peter brought in had already been done with a co-writer. To get the vocal for Beth, Bob had to record Peter singing the song probably a dozen times and cobble together a single version of the multiple parts of those days. Peter's chances of being able to sing a song off the cuff were about as good as my chances of throwing a penny at being in the mood. It would be a challenge for him to carry a tune in a bucket. Even if we sang a note to him, we couldn't find it. But since we had always presented our Beatles-based fantasy to the world, 4 band members all contributing equally, at some point Peter began to believe his own press. Perception became reality, despite the fact that we created the perception ourselves. We made it out as if we lived like the healthier Beatles and all made music together as equals, but that was never the case. And who should know that better than the people who were actually there and not contributing? Peter and Ace's contributions were never as substantial as we made them out to be in the press. The fact of the matter was that 2 guys, Gene and me, were the engineers and motivators of the Beatles in the world. Unfortunately, when we decided to create the Hell Revolution, we never considered the possibility that Peter and Ace would start to actually believe it and that their belief would bite us in the ass. But sure enough, their delusion started to create resentment and eventually fatal fissures in the band. Those fissures first started opening during Destroyer, as Peter struggled to record a song that was ostensibly his own, and we began to have to work around Ace, who spent much of the recording process with his priorities far from where they belonged. He sometimes played his parts with his rings and chains scraping against the fretboard and pickups, and then wanted to quit it and ready to take off. When I would ask him to remove the jewelry and do another take because of all the noise, he would say, "Hey, that's rock and roll. Noise. That's shit." His alcohol abuse is well documented. Ace also didn't hesitate to just up and leave the studio to go play cards with friends. I could not wrap my head around that at all. Even the job to get loaded and play cards, even if it meant having another guitar player handle his parts. Making music was my dream, and skipping out on that process was something I couldn't fathom. Besides, Bob Ezrin didn't try to recreate the Bob used on the line with its huge rolling of guitars and screaming vocals. He found power in other ways. He created an atmosphere of grandeur, brought in elements and things I love, like orchestra bells and Jimmy Rock. He made guitar chords heft by layering them and ramping out like a single chorus. In some ways, it reminded me of what I like about Roy Wood and Wizard, a big, chaotic version of Phil Spector's Wall of Sound. Bob added things that really struck emotionally towards me. He was also the perfect producer to finally understood the subtleties we didn't understand about using different guitars with different parts, or doubling a guitar with a different guitar, or slowing down the tape slightly and doubling the guitar over it to make the sound bigger because of the slight discrepancy in the tone. Bob knew the essence of great production and great arrangements, and he brought it to bear on Destroyer in a way I thought was groundbreaking for the type of music we made. Wow, this is what a real producer is. From that point on, unless someone could tell us what was wrong with what we were doing and how to correct it, whether it was a problem with the song itself or with the sounds, we considered that person an engineer and not a producer. When the album wrapped up, the live tour continued. We had a few days off in LA and we got together with Karen, the hostess from the band. The band and I had reached a level of success that transformed my relationship with her into a physical one. tide's tricky and we had trouble getting back in. Great. That wasn't what I wanted to hear, sitting on the cloth suspended between the two pontoons of a catamaran. Things on shore kept getting smaller and smaller. What the fuck am I doing? I read enough Reader's Digest stories about people stuck on rafts for a month, eating seagulls and trying to catch turtles. What's going to happen to me? I panicked and jumped off the boat. I'm going to swim to shore. As the catamaran continued to slice its way out and away from me, I yelled at Rick, "Do something!" The dope jumped in and swam toward me. Now both of us flailed against the riptide, unable to make progress toward shore. We made our way sideways to a pair of surfers bobbing on the boards. "We can't get in," I said. "Can you help us?" "Fuck off," the guy said, catching a wave and leading us out. After a few minutes, I was struggling to keep my head above water, and every time I dipped down, my feet hit the spikes of sea urchins, which jammed painfully in my soles. I looked at the shore and saw hundreds of people enjoying themselves. They weren't very far away, but they were totally unmoved. They were going to die. I don't matter. People tossed balls around or lay on paddles relaxing. The most important person in the world was dying, and the world went on. Nobody knows. Despite how much we fought, Mother Nature kept pushing our heads below the water. Just as I thought it was all over, that I was going to drown a few hundred feet from a beach full of people who wouldn't notice if I died, a little motorboat pulled up, people grabbed me and Phil, and dragged us out of the water. In the motorboat sat the owner of the catamaran. He'd been worried that we didn't know how to use the boat properly and had tracked us with binoculars as we sailed out. He saw us jump off and came out with his motorboat, realizing the tide was very